we're talking about the early 70s. The space started in 1972. And as far as I was concerned, I was very much aware of the apartheid laws, the Immorality Act, Group Areas Act, and so on. But to be honest, it didn't affect me personally. And most South Africans, white South Africans, were, and I feel fairly guilty about this, because although I was working as much as I could in the theatre and on radio against apartheid and so on, I wasn't really doing anything drastic. On radio, for example, Judy Henderson was my partner at a quiz show which involved couples. We desperately tried to persuade the SABC to allow couples of other races to come in. They didn't like it at all. But we went as far as actually getting a Union Castle boat, which is kind of the post boat, which started in Cape Town, went up to Durban, and then came back, and we went to Britain and so on. We would get aboard that, we would get passengers on there, and we'd get the passengers to do the show, and we'd pick coloured passengers and so on, and mixed audiences. And that's as far as it got. We'd been talking about the space, or not the space, but a theatre for some time. I'd worked with Yvonne from way back, and got to know Brian and so on. And frankly, it seemed an impossible ideal to find a space where we could say what we liked, in spite of what the government was doing, or what the laws were. But there came a time when the space became a reality. All of a sudden, there, and Brian can tell you more about this than I can. There was the space, and I was offered a role in the space, And I suddenly realized, now is the time for me to stand up and say where I stand. It was nerve-wracking and frightening, because I earned my money from the SABC, which was a quasi-government organization. I worked for the Nika Milan, which was a segregated theatre. Look, all things were segregated. Restaurants, theatres, cinemas, everything was segregated. And it was the only place we could find work if you were an actor. And now suddenly it was a theatre where you could do the things that you really wanted to do. And the dilemma for me was, I had a young family. I was living very comfortably, though with guilt. And to stand up and say, look, this is where I stand, could cost me my career. And it was the problem with many white South African actors who wanted to work in this space. But I knew I could not ignore it. And when I was told that the first play that we were doing the title was Statements After an Arrest Under the Immorality Act, I thought, that's it, that's it. But I'd committed, I'd spoken to my family, I'd committed, and what followed were the most exciting years of my life. We started with statements. I was scared stiff, I was the policeman who was extracting the statements from the two illicit lovers, a coloured school principal and a white librarian, who were discovered en flagrante, and arrested. My job was to interview them on stage. So I had a lot of time to sit there and think, because most of the dialogue was the two lovers. There were four of us in the play: Yvonne, Bryceland, Athol, Fugard, myself, and Christopher Prophet, who hardly said a word. He was just typing down the statement, whatever it was. And with half a mind, I was listening to. We were situated in a very sleazy area, Long Street. was considered then it's now a very upmarket, but it was considered then a very sleazy area, and there were lots of police sirens around. And I sat there, petrified that one was going to stop and the doors were going to crash open. And I told Sylvia, listen, if I'm not home tonight, find out what police station I'm at and get a lawyer. And, that was in my mind the whole time to that first night. Then it never happened, it never happened. And it didn't happen the night afterwards, and we started relaxing, getting into the play. It was an astonishing play. These two lovers being interviewed by this hard-nosed Afrikaans, but certainly South African cop. From then on, I did lots of other plays, but Statements stays with me and will always stay with me. As will other moments, of course. There was John Carney and Winston Chona and Athol collaborated on two plays. One was called Sizwe Banzi is Dead, the other called The Audacious Spun. It was called so because it actually was to be called The Island, but if you mentioned the island, it was Robben Island, and the band was finished. You wouldn't be able to do anything about it, and Sizwe Banzi was about a guy who was looking for work. The Group Areas Act, this is where the Group Areas Act came in. He was allowed to work in his area where he lived, but there was no work to be got there at all. So he comes down to another city. I don't think it's mentioned in the play. It would be Johannesburg, it would be Cape Town. And, the play opens with John Carney sitting on a chair, simple stage, nothing else on it. And he's opening to that particular day's paper, reading the headlines and articles. And I'm remembering opening night. He read that paper and he made comments, very funny comments about what he was reading, but it became clear to us that what affected the white people, the news was for white people. It was relevant to him, I laugh a little because he got so engrossed, and the audience was so engrossed, that poor Winston, who had to make his appearance, and it came out about 20 minutes later, a nervous wreck. But Winston now came to see a photographer. A photograph was taken of him in a white suit, and he was holding a cigarette. And for some reason, as the photograph was taken, he also took out a pipe, which was an image, and the photographer said, no, this is a guy who would have a past and would be very successful. They played other characters as well. We move on to when they go out to the Shebeen's and have a night out and so on. And the character John is playing stops and wants to have a pee. And they suddenly discover he's urinating on a body, dead person. And when they get over this, it occurs to them to maybe Winston could use that pass to find work. And what follows in that second part, the memories will always stay with me, The horrors of what the apartheid laws are doing to them. Their names are not important, numbers were important. He acquired, Winston was worse, Sizwe Banzi, and he was dead now because he had a new passport. And they would do things like talking about what the iniquities that they had to go through, the indignities they had to be put through. There was an audience there from the kind of upper class suburbs, mostly liberal people, and at one stage Winston, clad only in his underpants, grabs his genitals and confronts a woman in the front row and says, "Look at me, am I not a man? Am I not a man?" should I not have a name, And later on, either one of them, I can't remember who, would go up to a guy in the audience, and it was an arena thing, so the actors were within a meter of the audience, and he'd go up to say, casually say to the guy, "My number is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 2, 3, 4. What's your number?" And this guy would be totally bewildered because white people didn't have to worry about numbers. They had passports with numbers in, but nobody knew their numbers. They knew their names. Blacks, had no identity apart from their numbers. Then the island or the Audacious Fund was about Robben Island. It started with Winston miming a wheelbarrow from one end to the stage to the other, John apparently loading something onto it and wheeling it back. And, it started the action started about 5 minutes before the lights actually went up on stage. And I thought, well, it's interesting and so on. Then the house lights went down, stage lights went up, and this continued. And I got irritated and bored and furious. And I paid money to see, what the hell was going on? This was going on too long. I thought something had gone wrong backstage or whatever. And then suddenly it hit me. Suddenly I was there on the island with them. Suddenly I realized what they were implying, and which I got, what an absolute shock was. That was life. That was what life was like on Robben Island. Sweat pouring off them. So I think they were working in limestone caves or something. And when they finished, they're chained again and taken back to the cell, and they find that Winston has something in his eye. And it's obviously it's limestone. He's in terrible, terrible pain. And John Kanu on the stage zips his trousers down, takes out his penis, and pees into his own hand, and pours the urine into Winston's eye. It was a shocking image, and another image that will stay with me for the rest of my life. And he takes you through the infinite boredom of life on the island and the cruelty of the warders. And these are things that, hit me like a in the solar plexus. I knew about apartheid. I knew about the indignities. I knew about the things that were going on. But here, it was demonstrated in such a vivid way, that, as I say, those memories will stay with me forever. During the course of the island, the prisoners get together to do a play, Antigone, as it happens. And one of the members of the Serpent Players, from whence Winston and John had come, had actually been on the island, And he remembered trying to do a production of Antigone. Antigone was, it was about a woman trying to bury her brother. And they said, "You can't bury your brother, he's a traitor," and so on. She said, "But it's my brother," and so on. But, those were it was the impact of the total play that just rocked me. And there were funny plays, I was in comedies in which we laughed from the moment rehearsal started until the play ended. And Brian Astbury was the director. Wonderful sense of humor. We were insane with laughter and so on. The play itself had a message, not a political message, a social message, people who were unable to adjust. And we had to keep the space alive. We were being paid virtually nothing. Didn't bother me too much because I still had quite an income. In fact, the very first week's salary that I got, I gave back to Brian. I said, "Listen, you need as much more than I do." But we had the space, we had the time, and we had to fill the space with activities so that we could make money. And we had lunch hour plays, we had late night plays. I think I must hold the record for lunch hour plays. I did a program on Jewish humor, which was enormously successful, and then we had Son of Jewish Humor, and I had a radio program at the time called Call Back the Past. So I adapted that for stage, like I would say the roaring 40s, and we'd have a kind of an audiovisual thing. We did the 30s and the 40s and the 60s and so on. And everybody pitched in. It was just a remarkable period. It was a period of my life, that I've wrapped up, and I carry it with me like a parcel, and I will for as long as I live. And the most wonderful thing about the space was that we were able to say what we wanted to do, what we wanted to. We could speak the truth there without fear. There was an integrity at the space. We didn't throw big brickbats at people. There was a subtle way in which we could say what we wanted to. And it was exhilarating, Nowhere else in the country could people do that. And in many other countries, I imagine. But the space was absolutely unique in that respect. We had people coming in off the streets looking for work at the space who were drug addicts and things like that. We took them in, Brian did anyway, many of them, and they became stalwarts. They became directors, some of them just took over stage management and so on. It was just a wonderful, wonderful haven. And when the idea was not to make a political theatre. It was impossible to avoid, politics. It was to speak freely, to be able to speak freely. That was the idea of the space. And there was the obvious thing, the space was open to all, black, white, color, whatever it was. And in there you never felt that you were white, this one was black, and so on. It was a family. It was an incredible thing. And it seemed to me that if we could do that to the space, maybe we could do that to the country, Maybe we could have a real effect. I had no idea. I do know this, though, and people say, oh, you can't really tell. But I am absolutely positive that the space was responsible for the cracking of the barriers as far as mixed races and audiences are concerned. And there are people that will argue about this, but I am convinced that it was the space that started making the first cracks in the mixing of the audiences, because by the time the space closed about 7 years later, so even before that, everything was open. Buses, you could ride in buses. Even the haughty Nico Milan, the bastion of Afrikaans theatre, they opened. Every movies, cinemas opened, and so on. And I'm absolutely positive that the space did that. We defied a lot of things. We defied the secret police. We found ways of getting around by using the Space Club. We defied those people who said, you can't say that, or you dare not do this, and so on. We in fact defied apartheid. And it was no small thing. It wasn't standing up there and waving your fist or anything. But that's what the theatre did. And I thought, is it possible for this to carry on to other things? And it did, as I say, with a sudden non-segregation of theatres and so on. And it set a pattern for future South African theatre. And it sent the message across the world. People knew about the space. You know, we had to deal with agents and playwrights and so on. Many of them, because there was a cultural ban. But there were those, like Woody Allen, for example, who, when he heard our story, said, do it. Did play it against Sam and so on. We had Sam Gardner, who would absolutely forbidden his plays to be done here. When he heard the circumstances, he allowed us to do 1,000 clowns. So the word got around, you know, and there were people at the space that are in huge names now, all over the world. Richard E. Grant came, started this space. And Yvonne Bryceland, who sadly died very early, became a celebrated actress at the National Theatre. And young guys like Solly Fernanda, who I thought was just a little young punk off the street, now has his own radio show. And many others. They became, everybody, of course, after a couple of years, went up to Joburg because that's where the money was. But the space, it will be forever in my heart.